Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Comics Della Morte, episode 123, Confederate Monster with David Swartz. I think that's how you say your last name, right?
Yeah, you got it right.
Yeah,
good job.
I don't know if anybody says believe in the Swartz. That's what made me Spaceballs.
Oh, constantly. So, no, you did a good job.
Got a new subscriber. How you doing, Aura? Appreciate it. Hopefully you like everything.
I know Aura.
I figured it was probably someone you knew.
Yeah. He and I go way back to my last comic, Feast or Famine, that I did not all by myself, but I wrote and I colored it.
So before we get into your comic book and everything, growing up as a kid, when did you? Because you write and you draw. Like, when was the first time you picked up a pencil and started drawing it, on notebook paper or whatever, and figured, man, I'm not just creative and good at this, but this is what I want to do?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So honestly, it's hard for me to really remember when it all started, because I guess I just always remember doing it. So one of the things that I absolutely loved as a child was going with my Uncle Joe to the comic book store, and he would let us pick out, our favorite issue of whatever series we wanted. And, I always shop with my eyes, so I picked out the one that always kind of grabbed my attention. And
of course,
get home and find the big splash page, because almost every issue had like at least one big, full body character, drawn. And I would just sit and draw it and see as how good I was at being able to copy it and make it look exactly how I saw it in the book. And like I said, I remember doing that as young as maybe 7 or 8. So it's been quite a while.
Gotcha. And when you were practicing drawing and everything, at one point did you actually wanted to do this as a profession? Because there's a lot of things that kids do young, like they like to sing, they like to act in school, but there's a certain point it's like, okay, this isn't something I just like, I want to do this for a living.
Oh yeah. I don't think I really saw it as I'm going to do this for a living until later, when I was in my senior year of high school, where I kind of had to figure out what I was going to do for the rest of my life. Because I honestly, up until that point, I thought I was going to be in a rock band and touring around the country and just doing that lifestyle for the rest of my life.
Pretty sweet.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was in a band in high school for many years, and then years after.
What type of sound? What type of genre?
Kind of, it's a little weird, but ska. So rock, but with like a horn section.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so we, really had a big band. We had a lot of people that sort of came in and out, rotated through. But honestly, we almost always had about 5 or 6 of us. And so it was a big part of my life when I was in high school. But then when I had to buckle down and figure out what I was going to do for a living, I think I just gravitated back to drawing, because to me, I was naturally talented at it. I really liked it. And I thought, I could at least get a job doing basic design if I couldn't get a job doing, painting or drawing. So yeah, I got into, design school here in Detroit. And I, graduated out of the illustration department. Honestly, I thought I was going to be a concept artist for video games or TV. And my portfolio just didn't really kind of match with that. It was more of a match with comics. And I just didn't know it yet. So then I did graphic design, like I thought, for a couple years, until I decided I hated it. And so 10 years ago, stopped doing that and picked up the pencil and started doing comics full time, and been doing that ever since.
Sweet. Now, at one point when, you worked with a lot of people doing artwork for, but when did you actually sit down and hone your skills to realize that instead of just artwork, I can come up with a good story? Because in comics, the beautiful thing is if you're not an artist, you could just be a writer. If you're not good at, like, doing actual pencils, I have friends that are just an inker and are just a colorist.
Right. Yeah. So I actually, when I first started my comic book career, I came into it with the expectation that I was going to do it all myself.
Gotcha.
I was going to write, I was going to draw, color, everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I began with a story in mind, and I think a lot of writers, when you first start out in comics, you tend to gravitate towards those superhero stories because that's sort of where you got into comics through types of stories. So I think for me it was no different, and I really had my own superhero take, and I thought I could make a story out of it. So I spent a year doing a 6-issue series with my own superhero. It was about 200 pages when it was all finished. But at the time, I think I was, again, I needed more practice. I needed to, just have more time to develop my skills, both as an artist and as a writer. So I've been doing this, again, for the last 10 years. I've had a ton of experience drawing. And I think here and there, I've been doing some little, writing treatments, little pitch practices for myself of different stories. To kind of practice my writing a little bit. But yeah, with Confederate Monster, this book that I've got on Kickstarter now, I'm back to writing it and doing it all myself.
Awesome.
And I'm super excited because to me, there's just a certain amount of freedom that comes with, just being able to do it all myself and make changes as I go. And, if something comes to me and I want to, add different dialogue, or if I want to edit things down, I can do that. So.
Well, also too, not just with that, but I feel that when you're doing the writing, not just the artwork, you're challenging yourself as a artist to be like, okay, I wrote something crazy, but if I can't exactly imitate what I have in the words onto the page, I could go back and edit stuff. But as an artist or a writer, in any type of field that you're doing, you need to challenge yourself to become better. Especially when you don't want comics like with just nothing but a bunch of floating heads. Or with me, I'm a big EC comic guy, like Tales of the Crypt and stuff like that. Those were great, but some of the old school comics had so much dialogue in it where it was taken away from the artwork because how much dialogue was in like in some of the description boxes.
Right. No, and that's a good point, because oftentimes I do find myself when I get to the lettering phase editing down my dialogue or editing down my captions, because I put it in there and I go, oh, I could put it in there and it would be fine, but if I just edited it down a little bit, then it would give my artwork a little bit more room to breathe. So again, that's a perfect example of why I really enjoy being able to do both. For sure.
And I don't know about you as an artist, but me, I love also not just making the characters, but the surrounding, like the buildings and the environment they live in. Like the world that they live in is a character of itself. And I love when I see comics where you see big like cityscapes or big shots of like the surrounding area instead of just close-ups of the characters so much.
Right. Well, and again, I think it's important for good storytelling, because after all, as an artist, you're many things for the production of the story, right? You're the costume director, you're the set designer, you're also the cameraman. So you have to figure out, how do I draw my audience in without letting them get too invested in one scene, or not invested in the plot as it continues. How do I push and pull with their emotions so that I can keep them invested in wanting more of the story, right? So as the camera,
even with the simple scene where they're having coffee and you want a shots of like them taking a sip of the coffee or a shot of the hand in the coffee, like it's it's important to, have different shots of like one area instead of just the typical headshots again.
Right, exactly. Explore the environment more. Figure out how you can tell story through just editing down the shot, like you were just explaining. If you just show, a subtle, like I did this actually in one of the books that I was just working on earlier this year, where, it's described as the characters just sort of, touching the rim of the glass with their fingertip. Well, if you just focus on that and you do it very, subtle and very gingerly, then it has this sort of mood to it, right? So yeah, it's really important to understand how you can, take the storytelling further just by choosing the shots that you choose.
And I don't know if you add I am onomatopoeia words, but sometimes it's fun trying to find like that one type of comic book sound effect that would go well with that sound. Not like the typical pow, zap, and bam, but like thinking of one that would sound really cool. Like I can't remember this website, but it has like pictures, and it's like you'll look up scream, and they have different ways of a person screaming, like the typical like but then you have ones that are like a HHIEE. So it's like different ways people scream depending on the type of environment that they're getting scared in. It's really fun.
Yeah, no, that absolutely, for sure. For one of my favorites in the book that I'm doing now is I'm doing a lot of horse-like movement. So
oh yeah.
So I do a lot of like clump, da clump, da clump, da clump.
Yeah.
That's my favorite right now.
Awesome. So, you have this idea for Confederate Monster. When you sat down and you wanted to work on Frankenstein, was it like an instant thing, or you wanted to do a typical, like, another creature feature comic?
So when I first kind of conceptualized the story of Confederate Monster, it was really just a challenge to the writer side of myself to see if I can write a good horror story, because I had never really tried to write a horror story before. So I gravitated towards Frankenstein, mainly because to me, I felt like I had a certain affinity for the character. I've always loved Frankenstein movies and pop culture references and images and stuff. So I wanted to do Frankenstein for that reason, but also because I always felt that Frankenstein, the story of Frankenstein, was really sort of repetitive.
A tragedy.
Well, yes, it's a tragedy for sure, and I love the play of life and death in that, because it's the interesting, sort of play between what Victor desires and what the monster desires, and their desires sort of clashing and meeting, right? So
Bernie Wrightson, he did it well with his comic.
Yes, and I was very inspired by the way in which he applied line.
Yeah, exactly.
Something I did kind of add to the style of my art for this series. If you look at some of the art for other series that I've worked on, it's a little more simplified. Whereas this one, I wanted to add a little bit more line work in order to give a little bit of that Wrightson feel to it.
Yeah. I could tell.
Right. I'm glad you picked up on that. So yeah, I kind of just wanted to play around with Frankenstein in a different way, like see what kind of other story I could create, and that's why I decided to set it in a time period that's also very unexpected, like the Civil War.
Yeah.
And then out of that, asking myself, what type of story can we tell that is both, has sort of themes that mimic what's going on in the Frankenstein story, as well as what's pertinent to the time period. And honestly, I found a lot of things that meshed really well. One of those things would be, so my main character in the story is Igor instead of the monster, which is a big kind of change from a lot of Frankenstein stories. Typically, they focus on either the monster or Victor. This one's all really mainly told through Igor's eyes. However, he is now Dr. Daniel Schmidt, so he's in hiding in Confederate Virginia. And I created for him a practice where he is one of the sort of cutting edge plastic surgeons who are working with soldiers who are coming back from war with amputated limbs and giving them back these, prosthetic limbs that he's creating. So it's like he's sort of doing the same type of work he was doing with Victor, but in a way that really sort of, not only helps the soldiers to live a better life, something that he was also given as a child, but then it also ties into the technological advancements of that time that were so pertinent, and I think historically important.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, yeah, I mean, people don't remember, like, I don't think it was maybe the Civil War, maybe it was World War I, where a lot of these like soldiers, they would have to wear almost like, doll mask or stuff like that would cover up that part of the face. I mean, the person looked terrifying, but it was a cool concept at the same time.
Yeah, and it kind of started in the Civil War. It wasn't very perfected, I think, until much later, closer to World War I.
Yeah.
But in what I discovered, there was quite a lot of that type of technology being developed during that time period.
That's cool.
Again, that's why I thought it's a really good mix to be able to add a little bit of that Frankenstein-esque quality to what Daniel or Igor decides to do with the rest of his life.
Yeah, pretty sweet. Well, yeah, for sure. Because I mean, with Frankenstein Monster, he's made up of so many different parts, and it's like if he's playing a piano, is it him really knowing how to play a piano, or is it the person that the arms are attached to the body? So you never know. And it's like anybody who like loses like a limb or something and more, they're always going to be like, even though this is a fake leg, I feel like a freak. Especially back then, I could only imagine.
Right. And again, I wanted to really sort of ground the concept of what Igor chooses to do in a place that feels real for him as a character, because after all, I set up the character to be deformed from birth. However, his father is a drunk and decides to basically take his anger out on his son constantly. So he's not only deformed from birth, but his father constantly beating him makes him even further deformed.
Yeah.
And so, he is sort of discarded, and, I won't give too much away, but he finds his way to Victor Frankenstein. And, they have more of, in my story, more of a like master protege rather than a master servant kind of thing. So it's like,
gotcha.
It's more of like a father son kind of thing, where like Igor's really trying to be just like the best, version of the like best protege he can, so that Victor gives him all of this love and attention that he never got from his father.
That's good. I like that.
So I wanted to elevate the story, or at least I wanted to take it in a different direction than what is expected between the relationship of these two characters.
Oh yeah, for sure. And with that and everything, that's a really great storyline idea. With me as a horror fan, I always like when there's like a really good story instead of just the typical like gore with like the whole like you see back, especially with the early 2000s, you were having all this torture porn going on where it's like nothing but like ways to make the person puke. As I see it, you're gonna get me if there's a good story with a jump scare as well.
Right. And it's funny you should say that, because I'm not a huge like gore for the sake of gore fan, where there are people out there that just love that stuff, like the Purge movies and like the Hostel movies, right? But like even there was, I think I watched like the second Hostel or something like that, but it was like the one where at the end, like the person gets out and like goes after their captors or something and gets revenge. And like I thought that was kind of interesting, because it's at least subverting your expectation a bit. But at the same time, I wanted to add like a certain level of obviously like grit and gore and blood, right? was, I mean, we're talking about battles in the Civil War era. It was bloody as all hell, right? So
oh yeah, of course.
literally within the first like 2 pages of the first issue, there's like body parts being blown up, on the second splash page. So I mean, I don't shy away from that, but at the same time, I do agree with you that you have to have like a good core story, because it can't just be, in this case, page after page after page of just blood and guts and gore and death,
Yeah.
So yeah,
There has to have a purpose to it,
Yeah, right. I mean, and again, like the starting off point for me with this was, it's 8 years later. Igor's in hiding. The Confederacy finds out about him, and they somehow convince him to, recreate the process so that they can reanimate their dead army. And that's a fairly good starting point, but there's really no story there, right? You have to figure out like how to take that and add this story to it that makes it feel like, okay, the characters are going to not only make the choices that would make sense for them, but then, how do we, get to the end in a way where the reader doesn't see, how it's all going to come to fruition. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
It's more about the relationship between the characters than it is anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is definitely important, because you want your characters to be, complex. You want each character to seem like it's their own person, instead of, one dialogue and it seems like everybody's talking the same and interacting the same way.
Right, everybody's like pushing the same plot, what I
Yeah.
mean?
I mean, some people, they add characters have different, like, accents and stuff like that, depending on the setting. But overall, character development, not just in like the drawing, but in the writing, is very important too.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So with the time period, you were saying that he fit well here, because like there's so many different periods. You could have gone with World War One, World War Two, or even Vietnam, but you felt like with this period it was more important. Was it because what was going on, and at some point does he meet like different like nationalities of people, like Native American and stuff like that, because of the time period?
So in this particular story, I don't have much in the way of meeting other cultures just yet.
Mm-hmm.
But it is interesting that you bring that up, because I do have a kind of concept for that rolling around in my mind for a potential like sequel. So, stay tuned for that. Not entirely sure when I'll get to it, but again, I do have an idea for that. Anyway, so I do have, obviously, we take a trip to the White House at one point. We see President Lincoln, so there's a lot of historically, accurate characters and places.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to bring in, because I mean, the Confederacy is playing the part of the villains, obviously. And so I wanted to bring in, sort of surrogate, characters to represent that. So I decided on 2 Confederate generals. So there's 2 Confederate generals that were real people that I pull into the book. And the main one is Nathan Bedford Forrest. And for those who don't know, the actual Nathan Bedford Forrest was a vile human being.
Yes.
And he was he actually was the originator of the KKK and the first Grand Dragon of the KKK. So again, I wanted to like create a real life villain, or not necessarily create, but utilize a real life villain in order to act as the surrogate for this very villainous, group. So again, I felt though it's an important thing, especially since I'm invoking the Confederacy, in order to be able to ground it a bit in a little bit of historical, accuracy in that regard.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. And besides, like, having humanity be the villain, is there ever at one point where you feel like, besides Frankenstein, you want to have more supernatural going on in your book?
Oh,
like
yeah.
With vampires and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You know, and that's the thing is like I really do think that I could take it in a direction where we could explore other, you know, classic monsters, you know, like
Oh yeah.
vampires and werewolves and, you know, maybe even like Creature of the Black Lagoon or a mummy type thing. You know, I don't
Hmm.
know, but I mean, I could certainly see where you can go in that direction, because I think the time period works really well still. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I think that we've really established that there is a bit of a supernatural element because, you know, not only do I invoke a similar reanimation process, I kind of elevate it slightly to again
Hmm.
ground it in a bit more realism. I was actually just
Which
having
is great.
well, I mean, you know, after how many other years it's been since the original book, you know, we're a bit more technologically advanced as a whole, right? So like
Hmm.
a layman person, I think, understands that electricity alone isn't going to resurrect the dead.
Yeah.
So, you know, I wanted to again add another little element to it, which in my reanimation process, and I don't mind giving this away. I the secret to mine is I add a little bit of DMT, which is like a dimethyltryptamine. It's the most potent psychedelic known to man, and
Hmm.
my thought was, wouldn't it be interesting if the mind was flooded with that potent psychedelic at the same time as electricity was, you know, pumped back into it, and maybe that could potentially open up a portal to allow a soul back into the body, right? Uh,
Gotcha. Yeah.
well, again, it's a little expanded. It's still a little, you know, out there. You know, I'm sure it's probably not going to work if you really tried it, but you know,
Mhm.
again, it sort of at least elevates it into an extra level of, you know, potential realism.
No, but that's a great idea because, that's just of a character of itself, you know, where it's like if someone evil gets it in their hands, they're going to be able to create an army of Frankenstein monsters that are like bad, you know.
Right. Well, and to me, it's also it works well because it's like a secret sauce. It's like a secret ingredient, right? That
Hmm.
only maybe Victor would know about. And honestly, at the time, I don't think anybody knew about this, right? Maybe save for like shamans in the Amazon, right? You know, because that's really where it comes from. Are plants in the Amazon. So you
Yeah.
know, really, unless you're a world traveler, like my version of Victor is,
Hmm.
you know, you wouldn't know about this. So it's almost like Victor is not only a master at biology, but he's also a master of other studies as well, like chemistry and you know, electromagnetics and things like that.
Yeah. Very cool. He would definitely be a great person to hang out with, Nikola Tesla back in the day.
And I have a story for Nikola Tesla as well. That was my last one, Feature Family. It was a Nikola Tesla and Albert Einstein partnered together and go on a space adventure.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it was fun.
Awesome. So with, this series and everything, you have on the Kickstarter 1 through 4, like how many issues are you planning to write out the story where it's like, okay, this is how I want to end the completion? Or do you feel like you don't have a completion and you just want to tell the stories that are coming to your mind?
Well, I think it's sort of a little bit of both. You know, I think that for this story in particular that I'm telling, it is a 6-issue arc.
Hmm.
So I'm planning on going, you know, 2 more issues after this. However, I still could see, like we were just discussing, a potential where I could, you know, take things in a different place with potentially a different monster, or you know, a different set of characters, but
Yeah.
set in the same time period or at least in the same world. Um,
Hmm.
you know, in a new arc. You know, so say like
Gotcha.
another 6 issues are devoted to this, and then another 6 are devoted to that. You know, um, because again, I really do think that this story has the potentiality to grow and explore different characters that we're all familiar with, uh,
Hmm.
and you know, maybe bring them all together in some way, shape, or form. I don't know, but yeah, there's a lot of potential.
Now, with writing, horror comics and stuff like that, or even writing any type of comic, we all know, especially as indie artists, if we draw like Batman or stuff like that, people are going to be interested. But you know, as a people who loves Frankenstein as such a pop icon, like, were you intimidated at all, or did you feel that you were very confident to create something unique that people are going to like with Frankenstein? Because there's so many characters that people are so precious with, and they, you know, they want to down something before they even see the final product because they love this character so much.
Sure, no, that's a good question. Honestly, I feel like I was pretty confident from the beginning that I would be able to do something interesting. I didn't really think. I guess honestly, I never really thought that I couldn't do it, or that I shouldn't do it, because it is a very obviously well-known and beloved character. So no, I honestly think that what I have created so far, and what I'm going to eventually finish, because we haven't even really, I mean, we're just now at the end of 4 getting into Act 3 in the story, you know, so we're just now getting into the good stuff. You know, so I'm really excited to get the rest of the story finished and out there so people can read the ending, and hopefully, you know, I think it will be a bit more clear as to why I feel like I'm so confident that I did a good job, just because I really think it's good. So I'm hopeful that others will agree. You know what I mean?
Awesome. And when you first came up with this idea and everything, like, did you know Frankenstein was public domain at first? So,
yeah.
Okay.
Well, I should clarify that. I guess when I first came up with the idea, I guess I didn't necessarily know, and I immediately Googled it. So I knew pretty quickly that it was public.
Yeah, just people don't, you know, I mean, you know, as an artist and everything, but for anybody out there who wants to make a Frankenstein, you know, comic book as well, you could use the name and everything, but like the whole movie gimmick, you can't use that gimmick. Just like anyone who wants to make, like, I know it's far out there, but like if someone wanted to make a Wizard of Oz horror comic or something like that, you can't use like the likeness from the movie, but you could use it from like the book and then on. That's why people are now coming out with Mickey Steamboat and Winnie the Pooh horror movies and stuff like that.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting world in the next 25 years.
Well, we're halfway through the show. Do you want to say anything else before we get into the questions of like the horror stuff?
Other than to, you know, check out Confederate Monster issues 1 through 4 on Kickstarter. We just crossed over the $2,000 mark.
Awesome! Congrats!
Super excited to see that. You know, we have a $3,000 goal, so we still have a little bit of a, you know, chunk left to get. But we got plenty of time, and you know, I'm pretty confident we're going to get there.
Sweet. And his Kickstarter is in the description for anybody out there so they can follow it. So yeah, now the questions I like to ask for new people. When it comes to horror movies, what is your favorite horror movie of all time and why?
Ooh. Man. Wow, tough one. So honestly, I am like, this is gonna sound kind of strange because it's not necessarily. I'm gonna say it's only because it's related to Frankenstein, and it just popped into my head, and it's kind of horror, but it's also kind of comedy. I'm gonna just say Young Frankenstein, just because that's a absolutely off the wall answer to that question.
Oh, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. As I see it, like horror and comedy, for whatever reason, mix so much better than romance and comedy.
Yeah.
Like there's like, besides Killer Clowns from Outer Space, I mean, I remember watching the live action movies and then watching the cartoon Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Like there's just something with horror and comedy together, especially when it came to the 80s.
Yeah, it's like an interesting contrast, right? And
Hmm.
we all love contrast. It's what makes us, just go crazy for things. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more on that. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to like movies watching you're getting scared, what was the very first movie that scared you that was a horror movie?
Again, probably another unconventional choice, but it's the first thing that popped in my head as far as like my first memory of actually being terrified watching
Hmm.
was the first Jurassic Park.
Hey, nothing wrong with that. I mean, people don't think of it's a horror movie, but I mean, it has horror elements in it.
Oh yeah, absolutely
And
crazy.
and and back to like you writing horror and everything, I like to say that the one great thing about horror comics, unlike like superhero comics, it's so diverse. Like if you're not like wanting to write a slasher, like Freddy or Jason, you could write a horror comic that takes place in space, like Aliens,
Yeah,
or you could do a noir type of thing. There's so many subgenres of horror that you could
right,
just do whatever you want with it.
right. No, you're right. Absolutely. It's great fodder for great writing. I mean, especially the cross. I love the cross between horror and sci-fi. That's probably my favorite.
Yeah, like I get when people say Aliens 2 is great because of the whole like military going in and everything, but I think the first one is like more of a horror aspect because
Yeah.
you just have one creature going in there plucking people off in like a one by one manner
Oh yeah.
instead of this fast pace like guns blazing and everything like the second movie.
Right. Right. Well, that's more of an action movie, really. So
Mhm.
yeah, for sure.
And with my favorite horror movie, and we talked about it on the show because this show is almost 3 years old.
Hmm.
I love how 80s movies like John Carpenter's The Thing, body horror, but just I hate too much sci-fi
Yeah.
in horror movies. And that was the next question I was going to ask you. Like, do you prefer old school horror or some of this new horror now that use nothing but sci-fi and stay too much away from animatronics and stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a child of the '80s in ways. I would say I tend to have an affinity for some of the older stuff for sure.
Hmm.
When I was a kid, I was really introduced to horror through, the old stuff, like the original Universal monster movies, right?
Yeah.
So, to me, a lot of my fondest memories are like the classic, like black and white stuff.
Hmm.
But I
And you
mean,
being an artist just like me, you look forward to Halloween so you could do your own makeup.
so much. I mean, the only thing that is a bit of a drawback nowadays, I will say, is I have rocked this like beard goatee thing
Yeah.
for like time of my life, So like the
And you don't want to shave it.
little hard to come by sometimes, but
Yeah.
it means I have to be more creative.
Hmm.
Um,
Awesome.
but yeah, yeah, yeah. I will say though, as far as like the new horror, I would say I enjoy the new horror for the stories, right?
Yes.
Not
Yes.
necessarily the effects or the approach to the production, you know.
Hmm.
So yeah.
Was is there, what was I gonna say? So when it comes to 80s slashers like Freddy, Jason, Michael, was there one that like you really liked above all, and why was that?
Um, you know,
Because in reality, me and you, I don't know how old you are, but like growing up as a kid, besides like saying who our favorite superhero was, and it's like, oh, Superman could beat the crap out of Batman. At the playground growing up, we
yeah.
always thought which horror villain could beat up which one.
I must say, I guess I've never really been a huge slasher movie fan.
Yeah.
But I will say that I really do have fond memories of like the first Scream movie when it came out, because that
Oh
was
yeah.
when I
Classic.
remember seeing that in theaters when it first came. And that's like one of those experiences where it's like it's not absolutely akin, I'm sure, to the people that saw Star Wars in the theaters for the first time, but it's like a similar type experience where it's like you actually got to see a cultural phenomenon like in theaters, and that I'm not sure is going to be a thing anymore.
Well, yeah, because it was at that point where like horror movies, especially slasher horror movies, were kind of dying out, and you brought in this great concept, and it really made that type of franchise boom again.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, pivotal point for sure.
Sure, because you had Candyman, but like after Scream came out, you had like I Know What You Did Last Summer and all these other movies that were like, teenage, stuff like that.
Right. Absolutely.
Now, as if you remember as a kid growing up, going to the video store and everything, and you looked at horror movie VH cassette tapes or posters, like not watching it, but what was your like favorite VHS box design or poster for a horror movie?
Oh man.
Because now it's all just images of the actors, like with the Scream characters, but back then you had artists that would make these great designs that were never like in the movie itself.
Right. Man, I'm trying to think of my like favorite one right now, to be honest with you. The one thing that is coming to my mind for whatever reason is like the original. I think it's the original Halloween, the one where like the blade is like turning into like the pumpkin.
Yeah, that's a great design.
Yeah, always stuck out in my head for sure.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's not like full, you don't have like a giant, like taking up the whole page, but just something simple like that just speaks volumes.
Oh yeah, and I'm always a big in my approach to art. I'm always a big proponent of being as effective as I can, but doing it as simply as I can too, so that overworking it, I can maintain the same energy as the original kind of sketch or thought that I had, without feeling like it's got too much line or blacks or like weighing it down. Just trying to again do something simply so that it's not only effective, but it may even have like an extra quality of like cleverness to it that the audience might go, oh wow, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So.
Awesome. Now to another question. I mean, it's great because you're using a character for this question, but maybe your favorite one would be different. Who is your favorite Universal monster of all time? Is it Frankenstein or is it someone different?
I think so far I've been answering Frankenstein mainly because it's it's all part of my brand right now. It makes sense. But I think as a kid, I did really sort of gravitate a lot towards the Wolfman as well.
Awesome.
I remember as a kid, I was, God, I'm trying to remember how old I was. I was probably about 6 or 7. My Uncle Joe again, the guy who used to take me to the comic book stores and kind of got me into this whole world. He, again, when we were kids, he used to love dressing us up in costumes that he kind of made himself. So
yeah,
I remember one year he made us these Frankenstein like heads. So he literally like paper mache these like giant like head things that we would wear, and he
awesome.
like bought all the clothes from the thrift store, and we turned into, it was like me and my brother turned into Frankenstein. And then another year, my brother was Dracula, and then I was the Wolfman, and he literally like had all this like glued fur on my face and like painted my whole face up, and I had like fur on my like gloves and everything. Yeah, I've always, again, I really enjoyed Universal Monsters, but I think for whatever reason, Dracula's okay. I just think, I don't know. I think he's just been so overdone that I tend to not.
Well, yeah.
You know.
And going back with the, your comic and everything, pop culture has always wanted to make Frankenstein more of a hero instead of a villain. That's why you have one of the greatest like movies out there with him and teenagers and kids. It's the Monster Squad.
Oh, yeah.
And they did such a great job, not even with Frankenstein, but
Oh,
people who are a fan of the Loch Ness Monster, that Loch Ness Monster in Monster Squad is still one of the best Gilman designs out there, I think.
I absolutely agree. I mean, the design of all of those monsters really,
Yeah.
it was as if they took, the original designs and just elevated them to the point that, I'm sure that back in the day they could have wished that they had that, ability to do so. But
not just that, but how they said you could only kill the Wolfman with a silver bullet, and then they blew him up and his body came back together. I'm like,
yeah,
that is what they needed to show all these years, but they didn't have the technology back then.
exactly. And with such a cool, practical effects,
Yeah.
in order to be able to pull that off, because it really did. I mean, that again, I remember watching that as a kid and thinking like, oh wow, like that looks really real. Like,
right,
scaring the crap out of me. But yeah, that's one of the at the top of my list every Halloween, every October, I should say, because it's a big, celebration in my house, as you can imagine. So yeah, always watching the Monster Squad.
Yeah, for sure. Now, when it comes to like, well, you said Young Frankenstein,
Yep.
but was there ever a horror comedy out there besides Young Frankenstein that really captured your interest?
Good question. Got a lot of good questions. Man, I'm trying to think now. I mean, really, again, probably off the wall answer. The only thing that's coming to my mind right now is the original Scary Movie.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know why. I just, again, it was like one of those movies I remember watching as a kid, and just laughing my ass off.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things because it's so like, out there, because you don't see, unless you're like described to horror Instagrams and stuff, you don't see like the 80s ones like Street Trash or The Stuff, but the original Scary Movie, yeah, definitely is great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Now, when it came to like other horror movies, like you were talking about, like the Universal Monsters, was there ever like a creature feature that you liked, like Gremlins, Critters, anything, or Ghoulies, anything like that?
I did kind of I mean, I'm not really sure if this would, like, doesn't really count, I wouldn't imagine. I mean, I didn't really get into a lot of those types of movies either, I would say. I mean, I'm terrible at a lot of horror stuff, to be honest with you.
Hey, nothing wrong with that. I mean, like I said, everybody has their own like door in horror depending on how far they want to go with it.
Well, and it's funny because the one other thing that just like came to my mind is like a crossover between horror and like satire, like Ghostbusters, like the original Ghostbusters.
As I see it, Ghostbusters is a great horror comedy.
Yeah, I mean, even though it's not like a traditional horror, it's more, I would say kind of silly, I don't know, like the ghosts weren't really, I mean, some of them were maybe a little intimidating, like that dog thing. That dog thing scared the shit out of me as a kid. Sorry.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, it's all right.
So, but yeah, that just popped in my head too. You know, like I do remember as a kid watching the first Ghostbusters, and in some of those scenes, feeling like, oh man, this is a lot. So,
Well, yeah, I mean, they definitely, because I was watching on YouTube, because they were like the 40-year anniversary of Ghostbusters, and they were just going with like behind the scenes and talking about like what their ideas were at first, and their ideas were far out there. Like, they originally, Dan Aykroyd really wanted to take it originally out into space, but they honed it down to New York. And originally Gozer was going to be a male, and they were thinking about getting Paul Herman to do it. I'm like, I'm glad they went with the female, because seeing Pee Wee Herman as a villain would have been like
yeah,
more of a comedy out there. But
good choice. Wow,
mhm,
interesting. I didn't know that. That's interesting.
yeah.
Huh.
Oh, that's like, you probably haven't watched a lot of horror movies, like you were saying, but was there ever a final girl you ever liked? Because I asked that question too, because I find it great, even though that, back then you had a lot of the 80s horror movies. Sure, you had nudity, but the one thing I think that they did great is that they made the female the hero, where you had like Ripley from Alien, you had Alice, and you had the sister from Halloween, where all the men, they would die facing the killer, but the woman, they were able to get like this strength from within and take out the killer or the monster. And I always thought that was a cool concept.
Sure. I mean, I would probably say Jamie Lee Curtis's character in Halloween for sure, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Mainly just because it's just like, I don't know. I think Jamie Lee Curtis is badass. So
Oh
like,
yeah, for sure.
probably that's why I'm a little biased in that regard. I don't know. I think her as an actor or as an actress, she has a great attitude.
And her finally winning an Oscar after all these years should have been given to her a long time ago.
Right, right. I was really happy to see that, because I totally think she was one of those, just great, classic actresses, classic, character actress, really. I mean, she's done a lot of really interesting roles. I mean, one of my favorites of hers is the recent role she had on that season 2 of The Bear. I don't know if you catch any of that, but like,
No, not recently.
dude, the performance of a lifetime. I mean, she should have won an Oscar just for that one episode that she was on. It was amazing what she did. But anyway, but yeah, I would definitely go with her character for sure.
Awesome. Well, we're at 53 minutes, so we'll end it here. It was nice having you on. As I tell any of my guests, if you have anything else that you want to promote, just give me a shout out. Or, at times, if we don't have anything, if I don't have new guests coming on and a returning guest say, hey, I want to come back on and just shoot the breeze and talk about like, horror movie that I just watched. So, you're more than welcome to ever come on if you ever want to. Just give me a message.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. Thank you, Ari, and anyone who watches it in the aftermath. Go to Kickstarter and go, sub and support his comic, Confederate Monster, issue 1 through 4. And I hope everyone has a good night, and see y'all later. Okay.